What's up everyone, it's Goose, and today I really should be putting together my new PC. Today we're going to go over two neural products. One of them is of course the Quad Cortex, and the other is the official Soldano SLO plugin. Soldano is actually one of my favorite amplifiers. It's kind of a dream amp. I don't have the money really to buy one right now, but the new Astro just came out and that looks really cool. Of its clones, it's got like a lower mid-range growl and a high-end like evenness that I just don't think the rectifier or the 5150 have. Really only the Stealth comes close to that low mid-range growl in my opinion. Ever since I started using the default brown channel on my Boss Katana, which is based on an SLO 100, I've always preferred that over the variation brown channel, which is a 5150. And when Neural released the SLO 100 plugin, I immediately jumped on it. I used it to record a ton of demos, and maybe someday I'll actually release full songs from those demos. But fast forward to today, and I have a Quad Cortex with a Soldano model in it as well. But to my surprise, the model that's in here and the plugin don't sound really that similar. Well, they do and they don't. And that's what we're getting into today. Before we continue, if you like content on modelers like the Helix, the Quad Cortex, the Fractals, consider hitting like and subscribe. As usual, my comparisons, we're going to be taking the model in here and comparing it with the model on the plugin with the same settings. And in the past, some of y'all didn't like that. Some of y'all said, why don't you make them sound as similar as possible? And actually, even though some folks don't like it, I think the feedback has been that this helps show the differences between the models. Some people actually prefer the models that I don't prefer, and they can tell that better through seeing the differences when the settings are set the same. It's more interesting to focus on the differences between these models in my opinion, because even two players on the same amplifier or same amp model will sound different. And so finding the right amp model based on those differences, in my opinion, is very important. Also, this is a way to celebrate different methodologies behind capturing an amp model and how different the models are between the companies that make these models. We embrace differences here. So yeah, the Solo 100 model in here is based on an SLO, and it's going to be running these settings. And annoyingly, I had to do math because the SLO plugin dials go to 11, and 11 is basically just 10. So here's the conversion to the settings that I'll be using on the SLO 100. Additionally, I actually do have the depth knob set to 2. As you'll see with the comparisons, I think the biggest difference between the two is the low end. And adding just a little bit of that depth setting will really help show how different these two actually are. We'll be using the same overdrive. We'll be using the modeled Boss SD1 in the Quad Cortex, and that'll go into both the model in the Quad Cortex and into the plugin as well. The IR I'm using is the same one for both. It'll be the Own Hammer Rock Box with the vintage 30s from 2018, using the classic E1 mix. The guitar I'm using is my Keys Osiris with DiMarzio illuminators in the bridge. And a quick note, I ran into a little bit more noise in the plugin than I expected, and I couldn't get that resolved before this video, but it's not enough noise to detract from what we're comparing today. As usual, we'll be comparing mid-gain rock tones with the volume test, and then high-gain tones after. I'm also going to start each of these sections off with just palm mutes and simple chords, and then go into the actual riffs. So yeah, let's go. All right, so with the mid gain, especially with palm mutes, I feel like the Soldano plugin sounds huge. It just sounds bigger, and I think you could attribute that kind of to that depth knob a little bit. But I think actually both of the plugins are bassy, just in a different way. The plugin's bass actually just sounds big, whereas the Quad Cortex's just kind of sounds a little flubby, almost neck pickup like. Also, the plugin has slightly more gain with the settings matched, but it's really only noticeable with the palm mutes. Really though, one thing that stands out for me is how much the plugin is just clear and articulate in the high end. But I do think the Quad Cortex wins in one area, and that's the volume test. Feels more natural to play when the volume is rolled down on the Quad Cortex than on the plugin, and I think that's because the Quad Cortex has its input kind of set for the amp models to work off of, whereas a plugin really can't take into account like your entire input chain before the plugin itself. And thus the plugin is just a little bit more inconsistent with the volume knob. All right, so let's move on to the high gain tones. All right, so I love the high gain saturation of the Soldano plugin. It's like thick, it's slightly fuzzy actually, but because of how smooth the high end is, it just feels so nice to the ears because you still hear that like saturation up there, but it's just also smooth. And despite having actually quite a big low end, it actually does feel tight. There's a reason why this is like one of my favorite Neural DSP plugins. That high-end clarity is just on full display with the plugin, and despite being as crisp as it is, in my opinion, it just doesn't sound harsh either. Now, the Quad Cortex model is a lot tighter with a boost. It's a bit hunkier than the plugin, but that's always kind of been an SLO 5150 rectifier kind of thing, so it's just more on display here. But with the overdrive, in my opinion, that flubby bass is gone. But I also feel like the low end is just different than the plugin. And I feel like the plugin just nails the Soldano saturation more than the Quad Cortex model. So you might be asking on your screen, why not just capture the plugin? So using a lot of cables, I captured the Soldano plugin on my Quad Cortex. And then I did a little bit of adjustments. You'll see that on screen when we do the comparisons, just to kind of compensate for some of the differences I was hearing between the capture and the plugin itself. So let's do a quick three-way comparison with them for mid-gain and high-gain tones. So the capture is much closer. If I wanted a Soldano model in the Quad Cortex to use, that capture would be what I would use. There's still a little bit of differences. If I cranked the treble a little bit more, it kind of got a little harsh, but it never got the high-end clarity that the plugin has. However, the capture does get closer to that like bigness that I was getting from the plugin that I felt like the Quad Cortex stock model was lacking. I definitely prefer this over the stock model, and I might play around with the capture settings a little bit more in the future to try to get an even more accurate capture. However, as it stands, the way I see it, I still think the Quad Cortex model of the Soldano SLO is actually pretty usable. With some more EQ blocks, I could probably get it to sound the way I want. But I think this is exactly why people want the plugin support for the Quad Cortex. I know that one of the most popular plugins is the Gojira plugin, and I know a lot of people just say, oh, well, it's just a 5150. But ultimately, I've actually also heard that people just can't get the same tones out of those models in the Quad Cortex, despite being reportedly the same models that they use for the plugins. And this Soldano comparison I just did kind of shows that. And as always, some people might actually prefer the stock model on the Quad Cortex to the plugin. And if you do, let me know in the comments down below. But yeah, that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope y'all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Later.